One of the darkest chapters in American medical history, the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, was conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service in Alabama. The experiment involved 600 African American men, 399 of whom had syphilis, while 201 were free from the disease. The men were told they would receive free health care for bad blood, a local term used to describe various ailments. However, the true goal of the study was to observe the natural progression of untreated syphilis. These men were misled for decades, unaware that they were being denied life-saving treatment for the purposes of observation. No real medical care was ever provided, as doctors aimed to document the stages of syphilis from infection to death, often with false promises. Despite the discovery of penicillin in the 1940s, a known cure for the disease, the participants were never informed of the treatment option. Instead, they were left to suffer the full effects of syphilis, which included blindness, mental deterioration, and death. Even after public outrage and media exposure in 1972, the men and their families received little justice. This study revealed the deep racial inequalities in American healthcare and led to sweeping changes in research ethics, including the establishment of informed consent regulations. Today, it serves as a reminder of how racial discrimination can permeate scientific research, and its legacy continues to affect trust in the healthcare system within marginalized communities. Unit 731, operated by the Imperial Japanese Army during World War II, was one of the most horrifying human experimentation sites in history. Located in occupied Manchuria, this secret biological and chemical warfare research unit conducted unimaginable experiments on an estimated 300,000 Chinese, Korean, Russian, and Allied prisoners of war. The victims, often referred to as logs by the Japanese officers, were subjected to unspeakable horrors. The justification for these atrocities was often framed as necessary research for the Japanese war effort, but the reality was far darker. Prisoners were dehumanized and treated as disposable subjects in a series of brutal and often fatal experiments, driven by an unrelenting pursuit of military and scientific advantage. The experiments included vivisections without anesthesia, testing of biological weapons such as plague, cholera, and anthrax, and exposure to extreme conditions like freezing temperatures to study frostbite. Many prisoners were deliberately infected with diseases, dissected while still alive, or had limbs amputated. Some were used as test subjects for bomb blasts and flamethrower burns, while others were forcibly impregnated to study the effects of venereal diseases on pregnant women. Despite the enormity of these war crimes, those responsible faced little to no justice. In exchange for data collected during the experiments, many of the researchers were granted immunity by the U.S. government after the war. The grotesque atrocities of Unit 731 not only highlight human cruelty, but also show the moral compromises made by nations even after the war, as valuable data was sought from these unethical experiments. These actions have left a dark legacy in the fields of medicine and international relations, with the suffering of the victims largely ignored by post-war tribunals and historical accountability. Conducted by Wendell Johnson at the University of Iowa in 1939, the monster study earned its name due to the unethical nature of its design and devastating consequences. Johnson, a speech pathologist, and his team sought to understand how stuttering developed in children. They believed that external criticism and praise might influence speech development. To test this, 22 orphans were divided into two groups. One received positive speech therapy, where they were praised for their speech fluency, while the other group received negative speech therapy, where they were belittled and criticized for any verbal mistakes, regardless of whether they had speech issues or not. The psychological impact of these methods went far beyond the scope of what Johnson had anticipated. The children in the negative group became withdrawn, Some developed speech impediments, and others experienced long-term psychological effects. Johnson's theory that negative reinforcement could induce stuttering was disproven, but the emotional and psychological damage inflicted on the children was irreversible. The effects were so severe that some of the children continued to struggle with speech disorders and emotional trauma for the rest of their lives. The monster study was kept hidden for many years, but when it was finally brought to light, it sparked outrage in both academic and public circles. It took decades for the University of Iowa to issue a formal apology, acknowledging the profound harm inflicted upon the vulnerable orphans. This dark chapter in psychological research serves as a grim reminder of how vulnerable populations, particularly children, can be exploited in the pursuit of scientific discovery. The study's outcomes emphasize the urgent need for ethical oversight in psychological research, helping to shape the codes of conduct that now protect participants from such abuse. During the Holocaust, Nazi doctors and scientists conducted some of the most inhumane experiments on concentration camp prisoners, primarily Jews, Romani people, and other marginalized groups. Overseen by figures like Joseph Mengele, these experiments ranged from endurance tests to genetic research. Prisoners were exposed to extreme cold, pressure, and altitude conditions to simulate what German soldiers might face during warfare. Many died from hypothermia, internal bleeding, or asphyxiation. Those who survived were often left with permanent disabilities, enduring unspeakable suffering in the name of so-called science. In another series of experiments, Mengele focused on twins in an attempt to understand hereditary traits. Twins were injected with deadly diseases, had limbs removed, and were subjected to unnecessary surgeries, often leading to excruciating deaths. Despite the grotesque and unscientific nature of these tests, the findings were sometimes used in post-war scientific research, sparking ethical debates that linger today. These horrific acts, performed under the guise of medical research, have left an indelible stain on history and a deep ethical divide in medical science. The legacy of these experiments prompted the establishment of strict medical research guidelines, such as the Nuremberg Code, to prevent such atrocities from ever happening again. MKUltra, a covert CIA program aimed at mastering mind control, is one of the most notorious examples of unethical human experimentation in the United States. Beginning in the 1950s, the program used American and Canadian citizens, often without their consent, to test various methods of manipulating the human mind. This included administering LSD, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and psychological torture to break down subjects' mental states. The secrecy of these experiments was maintained to prevent public outcry, as most participants had no idea they were part of these trials. One infamous figure in the program was Frank Olson, a CIA scientist who was unknowingly given LSD. His mental state deteriorated rapidly, leading to his mysterious death, which many believe was a cover-up for the CIA's role in his psychological breakdown. The project was exposed by the media in the 1970s, leading to a series of congressional investigations. However, many of the files were destroyed, and the full extent of the experiments remains unknown. MKUltra's legacy is a chilling reminder of the lengths governments can go in the name of national security, even at the cost of human lives. The program's exposure led to new regulations on human experimentation, but its dark history remains an open wound in the annals of American intelligence. MKUltra also left lasting scars on many of its victims, some of whom lived with permanent psychological and physical trauma from the experiments. The Willowbrook Study, conducted at the Willowbrook State School in New York, targeted one of the most vulnerable populations: mentally disabled children. Researchers intentionally infected children with hepatitis in an effort to better understand the disease and develop a vaccine. At the time, Willowbrook was an overcrowded and understaffed institution, and conditions were deplorable. Families of these children, desperate for medical care, were often given the false impression that participation in the study was the only way their children could receive treatment. Parents were often coerced into allowing their children to participate, as admission to the school was linked to involvement in the study. The children were fed food contaminated with the hepatitis virus, and researchers monitored the progression of the illness without offering full consent or understanding to the families involved. Despite the controversy, the study continued for 14 years, raising serious ethical concerns about the treatment of disabled individuals and the lengths to which science will go to achieve its goals. The Willowbrook Study is a prime example of the need for ethical standards in medical research, especially when dealing with vulnerable groups. Its exposure played a significant role in shaping modern guidelines for research on human subjects. The Guatemala syphilis experiments were conducted by the U.S. government with the assistance of Guatemalan health authorities to study the effects of sexually transmitted infections. Approximately 2,500 Guatemalans, including prisoners, soldiers, prostitutes, and mentally ill patients, were deliberately infected with syphilis, gonorrhea, and chancroid without their knowledge or consent. The researchers sought to study how penicillin could be used to treat and prevent these diseases, but in many cases, subjects were either left untreated or given inadequate treatment. This experiment's inhumanity was compounded by the exploitation of vulnerable populations. The experiments remained hidden for decades until they were uncovered in 2010, leading to widespread condemnation. The U.S. government issued a formal apology to Guatemala, acknowledging the unethical nature of the experiments. However, the damage done to the victims and their families was irreversible, leaving a dark legacy of medical exploitation in Latin America. This case highlights the dangers of unethical research practices, particularly when conducted on marginalized populations without their consent. The revelations about these experiments sparked international outrage and emphasized the importance of human rights protections in scientific research. The Stanford prison experiment, led by psychologist Philip Zimbardo, is one of the most infamous psychological studies of the 20th century. The experiment sought to investigate how individuals would behave when placed in positions of power and subordination within a simulated prison environment. Zimbardo recruited 24 male college students and assigned them the roles of either prisoners or guards. The study was meant to last 2 weeks, but had to be terminated after just 6 days due to the extreme and dangerous behavior exhibited by the participants. The guards quickly became abusive, while the prisoners showed signs of severe emotional distress. The guards quickly adopted authoritarian roles, subjecting the prisoners to psychological abuse, humiliation, and even physical punishment. The prisoners, in turn, became increasingly passive, depressed, and stressed, with some suffering emotional breakdowns. Zimbardo himself was criticized for allowing the experiment to spiral out of control. The Stanford prison experiment remains a cautionary tale about the impact of power dynamics and the potential for cruelty in even ordinary individuals when placed in positions of authority. Its ethical breaches have since sparked debates on the limits of psychological experimentation. Despite its abrupt end, the experiment's findings continue to influence discussions about authority, morality, and the psychological impact of institutional power structures. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history's most horrifying human experiments, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment with your thoughts or suggestions for future topics.